Good morning, Magic. I'm Gavin Verhey from Wizards of the Coast, and today I want to talk with you about a big change coming to Magic with Phyrexia, All Will Be One. But first, I've got a weird question for you. Imagine you've never seen the card Glimpse the Cosmos before, and maybe you haven't. How long does it take you to understand what this card does? The first ability is pretty straightforward, but then the second paragraph is definitely one you need to parse through a bit. Now, here's another card, Forbidden Alchemy. How long does this one take you? Which would you say is more difficult to wrap your head around? Keep that thought in your head while I cut to the chase. In Phyrexia, All Will Be One, there's this card, Viral Spawning. It makes a token and then can flashback. Nothing we haven't seen before. I mean, I've cast my fair share of Call the Herds. But the more surprising part is that it's the only card in the set with flashback. How did we end up here? And will you see more of this in the future? Let me explain everything. Since the very early days of Magic, there's been this idea that sets will introduce mechanics that will then only exist in that set. And when you go somewhere else, they're gone. I mean, even in Ice Age, Snow shows up there and then goes away after the block concludes. Flanking sticks around for Mirage block and then leaves. This makes sense for a couple of big game design reasons. First of all, it makes every set or block feel distinct. Instead of having a mashup of all mechanics ever, that set has its mechanics. Then there's a clear break where you leave and go somewhere else. Second of all, it's important for comprehending the game. If you just piled mechanics on top of one another and each set had proportionally the same number of each previous mechanic, the cards would become very, very complex. This is how we've designed Magic sets for a long time. In fact, while this may sound wild now, we used to not even bring back block mechanics. These days, you can often expect to see one again, like, say, Proliferate in All Will Be One. But in 2002, when cycling returned in Onslaught, that was a huge deal. In the case of Flashback, I remember when it came back in Innistrad. That was something which got people talking. One of their favorite mechanics was back again. And yes, I know it was in Time Spiral Block 2, but what wasn't in Time Spiral Block? Anyway, the excitement around Flashback was because it's a fun, good mechanic. It's exciting, gives you things to do late in the game, and is a great tool for a set to have access to. And in fact, it turns out it's so fun that we've wanted to use it more and more. You'll see it or variants of it sprinkled throughout sets. Now, time out. In case you think you know where this video is heading, it's not just something like Flashback is evergreen now. It's something a bit bigger than that. Not unlike the Simic, Magic is always adapting and evolving to match how people play it today. And there are three pretty noteworthy changes from where we have been traditionally, where we isolated mechanics to their blocks. The first is that the older Magic gets, the more there is that synergy focused, or that calls out specific mechanics. It's really upside for everybody if your cards work together in the way you want. This actually really came up to everyone's attention when Midnight Hunt hit, and there was all the talk about Consider not having Surveil. I even made a whole video talking about why that was. And while under our design beliefs at the time it was quote unquote correct, it was clear that's not what people wanted. They wanted their cards to work together. And so you might notice that with the Brothers War, we actually have changed many older cards that exactly Surveil to now really Surveil. And Flashback is no exception. From Quiet Speculation to Rootcoil Creeper, the literal keyword actually matters. And while in Flashback's case, many cards do sidestep this by rewarding you when you cast from a graveyard, like Burning Vengeance, that's not always the case. And it makes sure future Flashback Matters cards work with these. This is also really relevant for deck building. As people are running searches to find all their cards for their decks, these will show up in the mix. Now, stepping back for a moment, why is it that people suddenly care about Surveil cards interacting together? Well, this is where the Hamza-sized elephant in the room comes in, Commander. For a long time, the most visible constructed formats of Magic were things like Standard, where these older cards rotated out, or competitive Eternal formats with decks that were so strong that these kinds of synergies were unlikely to be relevant. But in Commander, it very much does matter. If you want to build your Surveil or Flashback theme deck, it's awesome that these cards slot right into it. Commander's existence has also taught us that perhaps there is more room for mechanics floating around than we had previously thought. With Commander decks, we're constantly reaching back back into the well of old mechanics to trot back out on new cards, and players generally tend to enjoy it. We did test this out a little bit too with the rare cycling lands in Streets of New Capenna. We put them as the only cards with cycling in the set. We held our breath, waited to see what people thought, and it turns out it's really not a problem at all. It's something to be careful with, but an occasional solitary mechanic, especially at higher rarities, isn't necessarily an issue. And finally, just the information flow of the world is different now. Imagine it's 1996 and you crack open a sustaining spirit in alliances. How are you going to find out what cumulative upkeep is? Maybe your friend knows, or someone has an Ice Age rulebook lying around for you to borrow. But here in 2023, you just whip out your phone and it's at your fingertips immediately. And when you're playing on Magic the Gathering Arena, you can just hover over a card and it'll tell you. It's a whole different world than it used to be. And if you don't know what Flashback does, even with reminder text, it's very easy to find out. And then, just like any other mechanic, once you learn what it does, it actually makes learning cards more straightforward. Back to the very original question of the video, Glimpse the Cosmos and Forbidden Alchemy. No matter how long you've played Magic for, you still have to trudge through the second paragraph of Glimpse the Cosmos and figure out how it works. On the flip side, with Forbidden Alchemy, if you know Flashback, it's so much faster and easier to read. To me, taking a step back, it's clear that making Glimpse the Cosmos work more like viral spawning would have probably been the right move. So what does this mean? Well, toward the end of working on Phyrexia All Will Be One, Aaron Forsyth, wise sage he is, thought we should look into making a change to how we did these kinds of mechanics that were written out long form to actually use the mechanic. Props to him for helping lead the charge here. He correctly identified it as something to look into given how Magic is today. So Game Design had a meeting where we talked about mechanics that we used or would want to use in our sets enough that we should just be okay writing it on a card. And we came up with a list that we liked and expected would use this way. I'm not going to spoil the list as they're not all in Phyrexia All Will Be One or even necessarily the near future, and the list could evolve further, but I'm sure you all will have fun guessing what we talked about. Feel free to post your guesses in the comments down below. But okay, yes, Flashback is one of them. You've seen that here already, but it's not even the only one in this set. You might have noticed Oxidia Finisher also has Affinity. It's one of 3 cards with Affinity in the set. Affinity is another mechanic that just makes sense. We do cost reduction all the time, from Emery to Walking Skyscraper. So in the future, when we want to do a cost reduction like this, we'll just write it as Affinity. You can expect some other ones to show up in time. These are what we call deciduous. They aren't in every set, but if we need them, we can write them on a card, even if it's just a one-of. I'm really excited about this new world, and it potentially lets us do a lot of cleaner designs in our sets while making the gameplay and deck building even better. Now, there are 2 important things to say here. First and foremost, we're trying to be very conscious to not make complexity higher this way. This is definitely not a design excuse to suddenly make some wayward soulbond cards or have a card in standard that is 4 complicated one-of mechanics without reminder text. We're very conscious that we've been putting a lot of words on Magic cards recently, and we don't want this to creep complexity further. In many cases, our hope is this actually makes cards easier to parse and read overall. Second, it's not our plan at this time to go back and errata swaths of old cards to suddenly work this way. Glimpse the Cosmos will not have Flashback for a blue mana if you control a giant. But going forward, over time, having all of these future cards work together should be a boon for Magic. So what do you think about this change? Are you a fan of seeing one-ofs or more deciduous mechanics like this? What other mechanics do you think should be this way? Let me know in the comments down below. I hope now you all have a little more affinity for Flashback. Actually, that gives me a card idea. I gotta go write this down, but I'll talk with you again soon. Until next time, don't be afraid to try a new approach. You got this. Explosion of initiative decks, taking down Aarakocra Sneak, Stirring Bard, Underdark Explorer, and Vicious Battle Rager. So how did all of that go? Well, the Tron bans have worked out pretty well, and now the deck is in a spot we're happy with for now. Especially after the addition of Energy Refractor in Brothers War, the deck is firmly back on the expedition